The alien princess seized a human warrior. By dawn, her entire empire had changed. The shackles were cold. That was the first thing I noticed, not the hum of the alien ship around me, not the faint blue glow of the walls pressing in from every direction like a bruise held in glass, not the dozen armed guards standing at angles that told me their commanding officer was actually smart. The shackles were cold, and they had been designed for something much larger than a human wrist, and that was going to be a problem for them. My name is Drake Callum, Sergeant 1st Recon Division, Earth Colonial Forces. 6 years on the frontier, 2 full campaigns, 1 very bad winter on a moon that no one has ever heard of, and that I will never talk about at dinner. I have been in bad situations before. I have been in situations where bad would have been a holiday. I cataloged this one the way my instructor once told me to catalog every room I ever woke up in. Exits first, threats second, assets third, and never under any circumstances let anyone in the room know you are doing it. 1 door sealed with a biological lock that read something other than human, which meant it would not open for me by touch alone. No windows, but the whole plating had a seam running along the left wall that vibrated at a slightly different frequency from the rest of the ship, a sound I felt in my back teeth rather than heard, which meant a corridor or an access tunnel. Behind it, 2 ceiling panels that were not flush with the rest of the ceiling. Either poor construction, which seemed unlikely given everything else in this room was precise and deliberate, or a maintenance shaft running above them. 16 guards, 8 had active weapon indicators lit on their holsters, small green points of light that pulsed very slowly. The other 8 were carrying weapons they had not yet charged, that told me they had been called here quickly. They had not expected me to be awake this soon. I had been awake for 11 minutes. They thought the sedative they used on me would last 6 hours. It would have lasted 6 hours on any other species. In their database, humans metabolize sedatives fast. It is one of those biological quirks that sounds dull when a doctor explains it, and sounds like the best news you have ever received when you are alone in a room full of people who think you are unconscious. I kept my breathing slow and even. My eyes were mostly closed. My body stayed loose against the wall. There was nothing to gain from letting them know I was awake. Yet I wanted to watch the full guard rotation before I made any decisions. The guards closest to the door shifted position every 4 minutes, precise, disciplined, and therefore predictable. The 2 at the far corners had not moved at all, which meant they were either supremely well trained or they were bored and had found a comfortable stance and were committing to it. I was betting on board. Board guards stop watching the thing they are supposed to watch and start watching each other, which creates gaps. I was very interested in gaps. Door opened. She walked in, and the room changed, not because of any dramatic entrance, not because of any announcement, not because of anything loud or theatrical. The room changed the way a room changes when the most important person in it arrives, and every other person in the room already knows it. The guards straightened. The 2 corner guards, who had been perfectly still, somehow became even stiller. The air seemed to acquire a different quality, like the air before a serious storm when everything goes very quiet right before it doesn't. She was tall, nearly 8 ft, with 4 eyes arranged in a wide horizontal line across a face that was angular and deliberate, like something carved with specific intention. Rather than grown, her skin had a faint, iridescent quality, the way certain minerals catch light and split it into colors that are not quite any color you have a name for. She wore armor that looked ceremonial from a distance, but was not ceremonial when you looked at it properly. I could see impact scoring on the left shoulder plate, the deep matte discoloration of real contact with something that had meant business. She had been in actual combat wearing that armor close enough to something dangerous to take a genuine hit, and the armor had been maintained but not repaired, which meant she kept the damage there on purpose. She looked at me and I looked at her, and she knew immediately that I was awake. No hesitation, no double take, just the immediate recognition of someone whose baseline for reading a room is calibrated to a much finer degree than most. She did not seem surprised by it. You metabolize faster than projected, she said. Her standard was perfect, not the processed, slightly hollow quality of a translation device working in real time. She had learned it herself, sitting with recordings and references, texts, and the specific kind of patience it takes to learn a language that is not your own. That meant she had spent time preparing for this particular conversation, which meant I had been selected for a specific reason, which meant this was not random, and nothing about it was incidental. Sleep was boring, I said. One of the guards. The door moved toward me, one hand already reaching. She raised one hand slightly, almost casually, and the guard stopped as completely as if a wall had appeared between us. She kept her four eyes on me the whole time. Do you know who I am? She asked. Someone important, I said. The guards are afraid of you, not afraid of what you might do to me, afraid of what you might think of them if they do something wrong in front of you. That is a very specific kind of fear. It only develops around royalty or generals who have earned it personally. Your armor has a crest on the chest plate. Generals don't wear crests, so royalty. She studied me for a moment in the careful way of someone deciding how much a statement tells them about the person who made it. I am Seth Vel, she said, crown heir to the Vorjon hegemony. I had heard of the Vorjon hegemony. Everyone in the colonial forces had heard of them. They were most of the reason we had a colonial forces, 11 star systems under their control, 43 occupied worlds, a war council that had not lost a formal military engagement in 300 years of recorded history. Earth had been attempting to negotiate a non-aggression treaty with the hegemony for the past decade, and the hegemony kept returning the same response: there is nothing to negotiate. Not a refusal, not a rejection, just the quiet confidence of a power that does not recognize the need for the conversation at all. Sergeant Drake Callum, I said. Earth Colonial Forces serial number available on request. I know your serial number, she said. I know your service record in detail. I know about Kesha 7 and Mort Station and the border crossing at Delm 4 in the 3rd month of last year. Delm 4. I kept my face entirely still. Delm 4 was not in any report I had officially filed. Nothing about DELM 4 existed in any record I had control over. Whatever level of access she had, it went deeper than standard military intelligence channels, deeper than anything the colonial forces assumed was private. You were on routine patrol near the outer Marker of your colony's sensor range. She continued, a standard sweep solo. After your partner returned with a damaged suit. You were approximately 2 km past your colony's legal jurisdiction. Boundary when we acquired you, I said. That is a word, we needed a human, she said, a specific kind of human. Your record made you the most suitable candidate within operational range. I looked at the shackles on my wrists. Crystal was dark gray, dense in a way that suggested it was not a mineral found anywhere near Earth, clearly engineered to prevent something significantly stronger than me from pulling free. They had not sized them correctly for human anatomy. There was a gap less than a centimeter on the left cuff. I had measured it twice with the outer edge of my thumb while appearing to still be unconscious, suitable for what exactly? I asked. For a demonstration, she said. In 4 hours my War Council convenes. I will be presenting evidence supporting the position that Earth's current alliance proposals do not merit serious consideration by the hegemony. You will form part of that presentation. I let that land for a moment. She was going to walk me in front of her generals and show them what a human being looked like. Under pressure, she was going to use me as a data point in an argument. She had planned this, had chosen me, specifically had sedated me and transported me aboard a Voron flagship for the purpose of demonstrating something she believed was already true. What kind of demonstration? I asked. Kind, she said. That ends the debate. She turned to leave. I watched the way she moved. She walked with the economy of someone who has trained for a long time. No wasted motion, no performance. Just efficiency, but in the set of her shoulders there was something that did not quite match the certainty in her voice. I had spent 6 years in the field learning to read the difference between what a person says and what their body believes. Her voice was certain. Her shoulders were carrying something that certainty alone does not produce. You came in here yourself, I said to her back before the demonstration. You didn't send a guard to check on the prisoner. You came personally. Why? She stopped walking. She did not turn around. Rest, she said. 4 hours is not long. The door sealed behind her with a sound like a held breath being released, and the guards returned to their positions, and I sat alone in the blue light and started thinking. She had come to see me herself, not to give instructions to the guards, not to verify the security of the room. She had come to look at me. Before the demonstration, before any of it had happened, that was not procedural, that was personal, and personal meant there was something here that the official version of events was not entirely telling me. I dislocated my left thumb quietly, the way my instructor had demonstrated in the second year of training on a cold morning with a visual aid that had made half the class look away. It hurts every time. There is no version of it that does not hurt, but it is fast. And the left cuff slid free without resistance, and I rolled my thumb back into place, flexed my fingers twice to confirm circulation, and left the cuff resting on my wrist so it appeared closed. I did not leave. I had no intention of leaving. Yet there were guards in the corridor and a locked door in a ship I did not know the layout of past the 3 rooms I had seen. Leaving now would be pointless and noisy and would use up the one real advantage I had, which was that no one in this room believed I had any options at all. I had 4 hours. In 4 Hours there was going to be a demonstration. I intended to demonstrate something too, I just had not decided exactly what, because the best demonstrations are the ones you shape to fit the moment, and the moment had not fully arrived yet. The War Council chamber had been built to make people feel small. It was large enough to feel like it had been designed for a different scale of existence entirely, which it had been, because everything the Voron built was designed around the understanding that power communicates itself most effectively through proportion. The ceiling vaulted upward into a dark space that the ship's lighting did not reach, a deliberate choice, the darkness above functioning as a kind of absence that made the lit space below feel like a stage. The floor was a deep polished material that reflected everything in it with a very slight delay, like looking at the world through the surface of a perfectly still lake. 12 seats arranged in a precise crescent. 12 generals of the Voron hegemony, each of them commanding fleets that had never returned home defeated, each of them carrying in their bearing the specific weight of 300 years of being correct about everything. They all had the same expression when they looked at me, a kind of clinical patience, particular look of a person watching a process they already know the outcome of and are merely waiting for it to confirm their expectations. I stood in the center of the chamber. My wrists had been reshackled before we entered, both cuffs tighter this time, checked personally by a guard who went through the verification process with thorough professionalism. I had let him check them. I had also shifted the angle of my left wrist by 3 precise degrees, while his attention was on the right cuff, which changed the gap on the left by exactly enough to matter later. It is a small thing. It is the kind of small thing that you practice so many times it stops feeling like a technique and starts feeling like breathing. Seath stood to my right and slightly behind me, positioned between 2 senior advisors. She had changed into formal attire, a long structured garment in deep navy, with gold geometric patterning along the collar that caught the chamber light and held it. She was watching the generals. She had not looked at me once since we entered the room, and I noted that the same way I noted everything, as information about what a person needs and what they are afraid of. The general at the center of the crescent spoke first. He was older than the others. His iridescent skin dulled slightly to a cooler tone by age, his 4 eyes carrying the particular absolute stillness of someone who has won enough battles that composure is no longer something he maintains by effort. He simply had it. This is the human, he said, not a question, a classification. Surgeon Drake Callum Seth said, Earth, Colonial Forces Frontier Veteran, 6 years active service. He does not look like a frontier veteran, said one of the generals on the left. She had a sharp quality to her voice, quick in the voice of someone who considers bluntness a form of efficiency. He looks like something the maintenance crew left behind. Several of the others made a sound that carried the tonality of agreement or amusement. I could not distinguish which and chose not to spend time on it. Proceed with the sigh. Resonance assessment, the center general said. 2 attendants moved from the edges of the chamber with a device I had read about once in a classified briefing on Voron interrogation methodology. It was a frame approximately the dimensions of a doorway constructed from a dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They assembled it in the space approximately 2 m in front of me with the practice speed of people who had done this many times. One attendant activated the device from a small panel, and for a moment nothing visible happened at all. Then I felt it. The best way I can describe it to someone who has never experienced it is this: imagine that every bad memory you have ever had exists as a separate weight, and all of those weights have been stacked inside your chest without your knowledge, and someone has just told all of them at once to become as heavy as they can possibly be. The psi resonance frame induced fear directly in the nervous system, bypassing the rational mind, entirely targeting the ancient and unreasoning part of the brain that has not changed much since humans lived in caves and had excellent reasons to be terrified of the dark. It was not subtle, it was not gradual, it hit like something with mass. My instructor's voice came back to me from a training exercise that had involved a very cold room and a very long night, and a phrase he repeated so many times it became something structural rather than memorable. The body wants to panic, the mind decides. Every time the mind decides, I breathed in, I breathed out. I let the sensation move through me the way cold water moves through you when you are trained to be in cold water. You do not fight it, you do not pretend it is not there, you breathe through it. Steady and deliberate, letting it be what it is without letting it become what it wants to become. My heart rate slowed, the sensation increased. The attendant had adjusted a setting. I felt it in my teeth and in the bones of my hands and in the space directly behind my eyes where pressure had no right to exist. I kept breathing. I fixed my gaze on the center general, and I waited, and I breathed, and I let the stone in my chest be as heavy it needed to be. The chamber was absolutely silent. I looked at the frame for a long, even moment. Then I looked at the center general. Is it on? I said. Nobody moved. The silence in the chamber took on a different quality. The attendant looked at his panel, adjusted something, looked again. He looked at Savath was the expression of a technician whose instrument has just returned a reading that does not fit any of the existing categories. The sharp voice general on the left stood up from her seat. Her movement was not entirely steady. She pointed at me and spoke in Vortian rapidly, and while my vocabulary was limited, I caught the general thrust of it. She wanted the demonstration ended. She wanted me out of the room. She wanted the situation contained before anyone else in the chamber could look at each other and discuss what they had just witnessed. That was the shift I had been waiting for. Argument is distraction. Distraction is a gap. Gaps are the only asset that matters when you have nothing else. I turned my left wrist at the angle I had prepared, and the cuff released. One motion continuous from the wrist through the step, moving left and forward, putting the frame between myself and the 8 guards with active weapons inside the effective response distance of the other 8. Before they had finished the motion of reaching for weapons, they had not pre-charged. The guard nearest to me on the right had his sidearm in a holster designed for Vortian hands, which are slightly larger than human hands, which meant the retention mechanism released easily. I had his sidearm in my right hand before he had completed the motion of realizing what happening. I did not point it at anyone. I held it at my side with my finger outside the trigger guard, and I stood in the center of that chamber, and I looked at 12 generals who had never lost a war, and I waited for the room to go quiet again. It went quiet very quickly. The center general was looking at me with an expression I recognized across every species line and cultural boundary I had ever encountered. It was not anger, it was not the performance of authority reasserting itself, it was the expression of a person who has held a specific assumption for a very long time and has just encountered data that the assumption cannot absorb. I set the sidearm on the floor in front of me, set it down, not dropped it, placed there deliberately and straightened. I did not come here to start a conflict with your empire. I said I came here because your princess took me for my patrol and I would like to go home, but I want to make one thing clear before I do. I kept my voice even and my hands open at my sides. That was me being cooperative. No one spoke. I looked at Savarth for the first time since we had entered the chamber. She was looking at me. Her four eyes were steady and completely unreadable, and she was holding herself in the precise stillness of someone containing a very specific reaction, not fear, not relief, something more careful than either of those things, something that looked like a person who has spent a long time building a mental model of something and has just discovered that the model, however carefully built, was not large enough. I gave her a small nod. She did not respond visibly, but one of her outer eyes moved just slightly, tracking something internal rather than anything in the room, and I filed that away. The center general said something in a low voice to the attendant. The frame was powered down. The sensation in my chest dissolved as immediately as it had arrived, like a hand releasing a grip. Remove the prisoner, the center general said. His voice had a quality it had not had before, not louder and not softer, but more deliberate, the voice of a person choosing their words with new care. Two guards stepped toward me. I let them take my arms. I had made my point, and one of the things I had learned in 6 years of operating in situations where I was outnumbered and outgunned was that the best thing you can do immediately after making a point is stop making it. Let the other person's mind do the work. The more you add, the less they think. And right now, I needed every one of those 12 generals to be thinking. They walked me out through the sealed door and into the corridor. Behind me I could hear voices rising, the beginning of an argument among 12 people who had previously agreed on everything. I counted that as a positive outcome. Ahead of me, blue walls, a guard on each arm, and the growing certainty that whatever I had walked into, the door at the far end of it had not yet come into view. Seath had dismissed the council session early. I caught that from the guard on my left who reported it to the guard on my right in Voron, confident that I had no comprehension of the language. I had 40 words of Voron, enough to catch numbers, directions, proper names, and the emotional temperature of a sentence even when the content outpaces my vocabulary. The word she used for dismissed was a formal term, not a routine one, the kind of word you use when you invoke authority to end something rather than simply deciding you are finished. She had invoked authority to end it. She had gone to the observation deck, not back to the command structure of the ship. I thought about her shoulders again, about the question she had not answered when I asked why she came to see me herself, about the fact that she spoke perfect standards she had clearly learned for this conversation, specifically about a service record she had pulled from. Channels that should have been inaccessible. Something was here that was bigger than a demonstration. I was starting to think that the demonstration had never been the real point at all. They did not return me to the cell with the crystal shackles, a different guard, younger, with the slightly over-careful movements of someone executing a verbal instruction he had received very recently, led me to a room closer to the middle of the ship. It was small but not hostile. A bunk, a surface that functioned as a table, a container of something that produced a smell my body interpreted as food, though I wanted more information before I committed to that conclusion. The door sealed behind me without the sound of a lock engaging. I stood still and listened to the absence of that sound for a few seconds. That was the first signal. The second signal came 12 minutes later when the door opened and Sareth walked in alone. No guards in the doorway, no advisors flanking her, no formal armor. She was wearing something simpler, a structured, dark garment without any of the ceremony of what she had worn in the council chamber, and she looked in a way I found difficult to describe, precisely like a different version of herself. Not reduced in any way, not less commanding, just less constructed, less performed. She looked at the container on the table. For a moment, it is safe for human consumption, she said. I had it verified. You had my food checked. I said yes. Before or after the demonstration? A brief pause before. I considered that. Carefully, she had been arranging for me to eat before she walked me into that council chamber, which meant she had already been thinking past the demonstration, while the demonstration was still the official purpose of my presence, which meant the council had been working with one set of intentions, and she had been working with another, and she had not shared the other one with them. You knew it was not going to go the way they expected, I said. She did not answer immediately. She crossed to the far side of the room and stood looking at the wall, which was a visual feed showing open space stars tracing a long, slow arc as the ship rotated on its axis. The movement was peaceful in the way that space is peaceful when you are not in immediate danger from it, which is different from other kinds of peaceful. I had a probability model, she said, based on your service record, your physiological data, documented responses. Under high-stress conditions, the model produced a 31% probability that you would respond to the resonance frame with a controlled reaction rather than an involuntary one. 31%. I said yes. You built an interstellar political demonstration around a 31% probability. I made a decision based on available data and accepted the possibility of being wrong. She said that is different from gambling, and if the model had been wrong, then you would have responded the way every other species responds to the frame. She said the council would have recorded the result they expected. The treaty proposals from Earth would have been archived with a negative assessment. The hegemony's border expansion in your region would have continued on its current schedule. She said it flatly, without color, the way you state a contingency you had fully prepared for, but there was something in the flatness that was not indifference. It was the specific flatness of a person saying a thing they are no longer entirely comfortable with. But you were not wrong, I said. No, she said, I was not wrong. She turned from the wall and looked at me with her 4 eyes. And in the light of that room I noticed something I had not had the angle to see. In the council chamber, her 4 eyes were not uniform in expression or direction. The outer 2 were doing what eyes do in an unfamiliar space. Tracking, scanning, maintaining a baseline map of the room. The inner 2 were focused on me with an intensity that had nothing to do with assessment or threat evaluation. They were focused the way eyes focus when a question has been sitting unanswered for a very long time and the person carrying it has just arrived in the place where the answer might live. Why did you put the weapon down? She asked. I had known she was going to ask that from the moment I set the sidearm on the floor of the council chamber. I had known that question was coming, had felt it in the slight change in her bearing when I did it, had seen it form in the expression she had been carefully controlling. Because I was not trying to escape, I said, then what were you trying to do? Make a point, I said. There is a difference between being able to harm someone and making the choice to harm someone. I wanted your generals to understand the difference personally, not abstractly. Abstract understanding is easy. Personal understanding is the kind that changes behavior. They understand force, she said. The Voron have always understood force. 300 years of military record is not an accident. I know, I said. That is the problem. She was quiet for a moment. I picked up the container of food, opened it and ate. It tasted like something had been boiled in mineral water and then been told to try harder. It was not good. I ate it anyway because I had learned a long time ago that you eat when food is available, regardless of what it tastes like, because you do not know when the next opportunity will arrive. Your record from Delmer, she said when I was halfway through the container, the incident that does not appear in any official filing. I kept eating. There was a Voron reconnaissance craft that experienced a navigational failure in the border zone during the 3rd month of last year, she said. Navigation failure, atmospheric entry, crash, landing in the land forest system, approximately 4 km from your colony's outer boundary. Marker crew of 2, 1 adult officer, 1 juvenile. The adult did not survive the landing impact. Juvenile was alive and in critical condition when a colonial forces patrol reached the crash site. She paused. You were the first person to reach the site. Your patrol partner had turned back 40 minutes earlier with a damaged environmental suit. You were alone. I set the container down. Standard protocol for unauthorized contact with a Voron asset in a restricted border zone is to register the contact, mark the location, and withdraw to a safe distance pending official notification through diplomatic channels, she said. You did not follow protocol. No, I said. I did not. You provided emergency medical intervention using your personal trauma kit, she said. You remained on site for 6 hours and 14 minutes until a Voron recovery signal from a passing patrol vessel was detected. You then withdrew before any contact could be established with the recovery team. You filed no report of the incident. You marked the patrol area as clear on your return log. The kid was going to die. I said I had a trauma kit and enough field medicine training to prevent that. The paperwork question seemed too secondary. The juvenile's name is Varath, she said, and something shifted in her voice when she said it, not dramatically, just enough, a frequency change barely perceptible, the kind that only appears when a name carries actual weight rather than just information. He is 11 years old. He is the youngest child of Senior Advisor Velkith, who serves on my father's personal council. Varith told his mother when he was recovered and stabilized that a human soldier with dark hair and a scar along his jaw stayed with him in a dark forest and talked to him for the entire duration of the night. I did not say anything. He told her, she continued, that the human told him stories about a place with long hills and constant rain, about rivers and stone walls and birds. He could not describe to her accurately because the names did not translate. He said the human told him the world was very large and that large worlds have room for everyone to get home. Eventually, my grandfather had walked me out to the edge of the moors on a gray December morning when I was 7 years old, and the world felt smaller than it should have, and he had said that to me. About large worlds, I had not thought about it in years. I had been trying to keep a frightened, injured child calm in a cold forest for 6 hours, and it was the only thing I could think of to say that might be true in a way that helped. He was scared, I said. I just talked until he was less scared. You were alone in a restricted zone, she said with a Vorshan juvenile who represented under the terms of every protocol in both our legal systems and unauthorized military contact. Discovery of that incident would have resulted at minimum in a formal disciplinary review, at maximum, depending on how the contact was characterized, a court-martial. I know, I said, and yet he was a child. I said he was hurt and frightened and alone, and he was going to die, and I had the means to prevent that. There was not a version of that situation in which walking away was something I was capable of deciding to do. The paperwork was the paperwork. It waited. Why, she asked, and the way she asked it was not rhetorical and not challenging. It was the plain question of a person who has been trying to understand something for a long time from the outside and has not been able to find angle. He was not your species. He was not under your protection by any legal or military obligation. His government has been the primary obstacle to everything Earth's diplomatic corps has attempted for the past decade. By every rational metric, he was a liability and a risk and a protocol violation. He was a child, I said again. That is the whole answer. There is no other part of the answer. She turned back to the space feed. Stars moved slowly in the long arc. She stood with her hands clasped behind her and was quiet for a long time, and I watched her and ate the rest of the food without tasting it. We have a word in Voron, she said eventually. Sethar, it is the organizing principle of every action our empire has taken in 300 years. It means action justified by its benefit to Vorian continuity and strength. Every military engagement, every occupied world, every rejected treaty, and every imposed governance system, all of it is measured against Sethvar. If it serves the Voron, it is correct. If it does not, it requires justification. That is a useful organizing principle for building an empire. I said it is an exceptionally useful principle for building an empire. She said it is not a useful principle for understanding why a human soldier sits in a cold forest for 6 hours talking to an injured child who has no capacity to offer anything. Return. She paused. I have been looking for Yorshan equivalent of what you did. For 2 years, I have consulted our philosophical archives, our oldest texts. I cannot find one. Our language does not contain a word for action take, and purely in the interest of a being you have no structural obligation to protect, for help given when help costs something real and returns nothing calculable. We barely have a word for it either, I said. We just call it being decent, or sometimes we call it being human, though. That second one is not very useful as a general concept. She turned from the space feed and looked at me. The blue light of the room made the iridescent quality of her skin very pronounced, splitting the light in ways that shifted. As she moved, she looked like something translated from a world where physics had made different creative decisions. And in that moment, she also looked very tired in a way that had nothing to do with a lack of sleep. Tell me what you actually think of your empire, I said. Not the official version, the version you think about at whatever time is the equivalent of 3:00 in the morning for you when you are not performing the role. She was very still for a moment. Then she sat down on the far edge of the bunk and she was quiet for a moment longer, and then she began to talk. She talked about the compact, about growing up, reading it as the foundational truth of her world, and then slowly over years beginning to find the cracks in it, the way you find cracks in a wall that looks solid until the light hits it from a different angle. She talked about the 43 occupied worlds, about the species on those worlds whose entire systems of governance and culture and accumulated knowledge had been subordinated to hegemony administration on the basis of a classification that was 9 generations old and had never been reassessed. She talked about growing up, knowing that the empire she was going to inherit was built on something she was not entirely certain was true, and not having anyone she could say that to. Outside, the stars moved, the ship hummed, the long night stretched between us and became something I had not expected when I woke up in a cell 11 hours earlier. The beginning of an honest conversation between two people who were supposed to be on opposite sides of something and had found unexpectedly that the line between those sides was drawn on a map that neither of them had made. She talked for a long time and I listened the way I had learned to listen in the field, not waiting for my turn to speak, not building my response while someone else was still talking, but actually listening, letting what she said settle before deciding what it meant. It is harder than it sounds. Most people do not actually listen. They pause. She told me about a world called Keithner, which had been brought under hegemony governance 60 years ago. The Kethner people had a system of distributed governance that was unlike anything the compact had. A category for a living network of local councils that had been managing a civilization of 300 million people for over 2,000 years without a central authority. The survey team had assessed them as grade 3, lesser willed, incapable of self-governance at scale, because the survey team had arrived during a period of local seasonal migration and found the primary population centers nearly empty. They had seen an abandoned city and called it evidence of organizational collapse. The distributed governance system that had functioned for 2,000 years was currently being replaced under hegemony administration by a centralized structure that the Cathnar people had no cultural or institutional framework to maintain. It was failing. It had been failing for 40 years. The hegemony's response to the failure was to add more administrative oversight, which was the organizational equivalent of treating a broken bone by pressing harder on it. Does anyone in your council know this? I asked. Everyone in my council knows this, she said. It is in the administrative reports. It is documented. In the quarterly assessments, it has been escalating for 4 decades. She paused. They do not read it as a failure of the governance model. They read it as a failure of the Kethner people to adapt. The compact does not provide a mechanism for concluding that the hegemon's model might be wrong. It only provides mechanisms for concluding that the population being governed needs more direction. Because the compact says they are lesser-willed, I said. Because the compact says they are lesser-willed, she confirmed. And because the compact says they are lesser-willed, any evidence of difficulty is interpreted as confirmation of lesser will rather than as evidence that the classification might be incorrect. It is self-reinforcing. Every failure becomes proof that more control is required. Every resistance becomes proof that the resistance is coming from a diminished capacity for rational governance rather than from the entirely rational experience of having a 2,000-year-old functional system dismantled and replaced with something foreign and failing. She turned from the space feed, and I could see what the night had cost. Sorry. Not in a dramatic way, not in exhaustion or distress, but in the quiet way that honesty costs people who have not been able to be honest for a long time. There is a specific tiredness that comes from finally saying the thing you have been carrying. There are 43 worlds, she said quietly, 43 case files like Kethner, each with their own specific version of the same fundamental error. 43 civilizations that were assessed in a matter of days by survey teams, operating on criteria that were set 9 generations ago and never been examined by anyone who had a reason to question them. She looked at her hands. My father knows. He has always known. He is not a cruel person. He is a person who built his entire life on the compact and has no framework for the possibility that the framework itself is wrong, and so he manages the contradictions instead of addressing them. That is what I was trained to do. That is what I was going to do until Vareth. I said until Vareth, she said, a human soldier who had no obligation and no witness and no calculus of benefit, sat in a cold forest and kept my advisor's child alive, and I could not find that in the compact. I could not find a category for it. I could not find a word for the thing that made you do it, and the longer I looked, the more clearly I could see that the absence of that word was not a gap in our vocabulary, it was a gap in everything the compact is built on. She was quiet for a moment. A framework for civilization that has no word for decency is not a framework for civilization. It is a framework for something else dressed in civilization. Clothes. Outside, the stars moved, patient and indifferent, in their long, slow arc. The ship hummed around us. Night stretched on. She had not slept, and neither had I. The ship's internal lighting had been cycling slowly through its version of night and was beginning its shift toward dawn, a gradual brightening of the overhead panels that moved through a spectrum of pale gold before settling toward the cool white of operational hours. We had been talking for most of the long cycle, not arguing, not managing each other, talking the way people talk when they have stopped performing what they are supposed to be and have started being what they actually are. She had shown me the compact, pulled it up on a small display. panel in her formal capacity as the person who could authorize access to any document in the Hegman system, the original text in Old Voron script on the left side of the screen, and a standard translation on the right that she had produced herself. I could tell it was hers because machine translation produces a certain flatness, a one-word replacement that misses the texture of meaning. Her translation had texture. She had thought about how the words worked in both languages, not just what they technically said. I read it carefully. The compact was 9 sections, each section with subsections, each subsection with numbered provisions. It was thorough and internally consistent and built with the kind of careful legal architecture that is designed to be self-reinforcing, each part supporting every other part so that challenging any element requires challenging the whole structure. It was brilliant work. It was also built on a false premise, and the false premise was simple enough that once you saw it, you could not unsee it. The compact classified all species encountered by the Vorchan into 4 grades based on a set of criteria established at the compact's founding 9 generations ago. Grade 1 through 4, with Grade 1 being Voron themselves and Grade 4 being species deemed to have no capacity for what the compact called directed civilization. Humanity had been assessed at Grade 3, lesser-willed, capable of limited organization but not self-governance on the scale required for hegemony partnership. Grade 3 species were subject to eventual administrative incorporation under Voron oversight. The classification had been set 40 years ago, not at the compact's founding. I found the note in the appendix section. A survey team, 11 days of observation, 3 frontier settlements, 11 days. I said yes. You classified 8 billion people based on 11 days of observation of 3 frontier settlements. She did not answer, which was the only kind of answer that statement needed. I set the display down. When was this last formally reviewed? The compact has never been formally reviewed in 300 years. Compact is the foundation, she said, and I could hear in the way she said it that she was reciting something she had been told rather than something she believed. Foundations are not reviewed, they are built on. You review the foundation when you see cracks forming. I said my grandfather built houses. He told me that the most dangerous thing any builder can do is assume the foundation is sound because the walls are still standing. The walls can stand for a long time after the foundation starts failing, right up until they do not. She was quiet outside stars. There is a faction within the council, she said. Eventually, led by General Oren, he has been advocating for a formal expansion declaration toward Earth system for the past 3 years. My father has blocked it, but my father's capacity to block things is narrowing. He is not well. The council knows it. She paused. In 6 months, when I take formal leadership of the hegemony, the first agenda item will be that expansion declaration. Oren has the votes to push it through unless I can offer an alternative that the council considers credible. I was very still. And you do not want to make the declaration? I said. What I want, she said, and the care in her phrasing was evident and deliberate, and what I am required to do under the terms of the compact are not always the same thing. I took an oath to the compact when I was confirmed as heir. That oath was not symbolic. Then changed the compact. I Said, you make that sound like a sentence. She said, it is not a sentence, it is a decade. I know it is. Not simple, I said. Simple and possible are different words for a reason. I am not saying it is simple, I am saying it is possible. A review, she said softly. To herself as much as to me, a formal review of the compact, calling for one, would mean opening the foundational law of the entire hegemony, external participation. Every species currently under Voron governance would have to be represented. Earth would have to be included. The process would take years. It would create significant instability in systems that currently run on the assumption of permanence. The Council would read it as weakness. Oren would use it as a platform. Oren is going to use whatever position you give him. I said the only real question is whether you give him a pretext or a problem. War with Earth is a pretext. Wars are things Oren knows how to navigate. He has a model for them. They fit inside his understanding of the world. A review is a problem. A review puts the foundation of every assumption his entire career rests on up for open examination by people he has spent 3 centuries calling lesser. Those are not equivalent threats. One of them makes Oren stronger. The other one makes him desperate, and desperate people make mistakes that confident people never make. She came away from the space feed and looked at me. The pale gold of the dawn cycle was beginning. The overhead panels warming slowly. Vareth asked his mother, she said, when the news came through about Earth's latest treaty proposal, whether the humans sending it were brave. His mother told him she did not know. He told her that the human from the forest seemed brave, but not in the way he expected. He said it seemed like a kind of bravery that did not need anyone to know about it. He was 11 years old and alone in the dark. I said he deserved better than being alone in the dark. Yes, she said, he did. She paused. So do the 43 worlds currently under hegemony administration that were assessed by survey teams who spent less time with them than it takes to understand a city, let alone a civilization. The ship's alarm activated. Then 3 short tones and 1 long one, a pattern I had heard once in passing through a corridor when a guard had used it in conversation with another guard in a context I had partially understood. Command deck senior personnel, not a general emergency, a specific summons. Her posture changed. Not dramatically, just the slight adjustment of a person who has heard a sound they expected and is now deciding how to respond to it. That is Oren, she said. He has been collecting information since I dismissed the council session. He has had enough time to assemble what he needs. What does he need? I asked. Signatures, she said. 3 council members can open a formal inquiry into an heir's conduct. 5 can initiate a preliminary hearing. 7 can begin a formal succession review. She looked toward the door. He will have spent the night securing commitments. How many do you think he has? She considered. 5. Possibly T6. He will present with 5 and hold the additional ones in reserve to produce at the hearing if I can test the preliminary, and 7 activates the review. 7 activates everything, she said. She moved toward the door. I stood. She stopped and looked at me. Stay here. No, I said. She held my gaze. You are my prisoner. You left the door unlocked, I said. A prisoner within unlocked door is a guest who has not yet chosen to leave. You have not asked me To leave, you came here alone without guards, without advisors at a moment when your political situation was actively deteriorating and you spent the night having the most honest conversation you have probably had in years. I do not think you came here to talk. I think you came here because you needed someone in that room with you who had no reason to perform anything and every reason to be straight with you. That is not a prisoner relationship, so I am coming with you, and if that causes a problem, we will deal with the problem together. She looked at me for a moment. That was longer than a simple decision required. Then she opened the door. She led the way through the corridors, and I followed 2 steps behind, watching the ship around me with the same habit I applied to every new environment. The corridors at this hour were quiet, the pale gold of the dawn cycle washing the walls in a color that softened the precision of everything around us. We passed 3 guards in the first corridor, all of whom registered Seath's presence and straightened, and none of whom registered mine with anything other than a brief professional assessment. I was still categorized as a prisoner in the ship's administrative structure. Prisoners who were walking unconstrained alongside the heir apparent at dawn were an unusual category, and I could see the guards processing it in real time, trying to find the right response. Seath gave them none. She walked past them without acknowledgement, which in Voron command culture I gathered from the night's conversation was itself a form of communication. An heir who acknowledges a guard's confusion is an heir who has something to explain. An heir who does not acknowledge it is an heir for whom the situation requires no explanation, because it is simply what is happening. I kept up. The second corridor was longer, and she slowed slightly, not from hesitation, but from the pace of someone thinking through what they were walking toward. I matched the pace. Orin has been preparing for this since before the council session, she said without looking at me. He would have started building his case the moment I dismiss the session early. He has people in every part of this ship whose function is to report unusual activity to him. He will have a record of every hour of the night cycle. Does that change what you are going to do? I asked. No, she said. It changes the order in which I do it. He is going to present his case before I have the opportunity to make mine to the full council. That is the purpose of the preliminary observation under the charter. It is designed to put the heir on the defensive from the opening statement, so you need to change the opening. I said I need to change the entire frame. She said he is going to present this as a failure of judgment. A crown heir who spent the night in private unsupervised conversation with a grade 3 foreign military asset, without protocols, without records, without the oversight the charter requires in the compact's framework. That is an indefensible position. The charter exists specifically to prevent heirs from acting on personal judgment over institutional process. Is he wrong? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. He is not wrong about the facts, she said. He is wrong about what the facts mean. Then you make the case for what they mean, I said. Not defensively. You do not respond to his frame. You present yours first, and you present it on the compact's own terms. If the compact contains the mechanism for a review, and it does, then what happened tonight is not a violation of the charter. It is the beginning of an exercise of the charter's most fundamental provision. That is a different case entirely. She Did not respond immediately. We turned into a third corridor, and ahead I could see the wider door that indicated the command deck. Light was visible under it, not the dawn cycle gold, but the brighter operational white, and the sound of voices, low and deliberate. "You read the compact in one night," she said. "I read what you showed me." I said. "You translated it yourself." That translation was very careful. A careful translation is the work of someone who has read a document many times and understands it well enough to be precise about what it says rather than what it appears to say. "You already know the argument. You have been building it for a long time." She stopped outside the command deck door. "In Voron culture," she said, "an heir who enters a formal council proceeding, accompanied by the individual who is the subject of the proceeding, is making a specific statement. It is not a statement of defense, it is a statement of position. It says this individual stands at my side by my choice. I am not explaining that choice, I am asserting it. Is that a useful statement to make?" "Right now," I asked. "It is an honest one," she said. "I have been spending too long on useful. I would like to try honest for a while and see where it leads." She opened the door. The room assembled itself in front of me. In the 2 seconds of entry assessment, I applied to every new space. Oren at the display arc center, positioned with precision. 2 generals flanking, advisors behind, security personnel at the edges, tactical configuration on the right, standard on the left, 14 total. The geometry of the room had been arranged. He had been here long enough to arrange it. He looked at me first, then at Seath. His expression was the expression of someone whose preparation has been confirmed by the arrival of exactly what he predicted. He began his formal statement, and it was thorough, and it was built correctly, each clause connected to the next, each provision cited accurately, each fact stated with precision. He was not a fool and had not become the most powerful general in an undefeated empire by being careless. The case he was making was a good case, on its own terms and on its own terms. It was very difficult to answer. He finished with the document, the formal observation with 5 endorsements placed on the display surface. He invoked Article 9, the temporary transfer of command authority during a conduct review, and the room was very still. Then the security personnel moved toward me, and I moved first, and then I was standing in the center of the command deck with 2 officers on the floor and my hands open, and the geometry of the room had changed. I looked at Oren. I could see him recalculating. Confident people recalculate. It is what makes them dangerous, and also what makes them vulnerable in the specific moment, when the variable that changes is the one they were most certain about. I gave Seveth the moment, and she took it. I watched her build the argument in real time. She cited section numbers and provision codes from memory, which meant she had not merely read the compact but had internalized it at a level that went beyond preparation. This was not something she had assembled in the night. This was something she had been constructing for years, waiting for the moment when the circumstances allowed her to make it, the moment when she could make the case for the review, not as a challenger to the compact, but as its most serious student. Oren's face moved through it. I watched the controlled patience become a tightening in his outer eyes at the provisions she cited in Section 6, a subsection dealing with the rights and responsibilities of the ruling heir in matters of foundational law that had apparently not been invoked in over 2 centuries. I watched the tightening become a longer stillness as she connected that provision to Section 2, and Section 2 to the founding principle that preceded the entire classification system, the principle that the compact existed to serve the advancement of civilization rather than to serve itself. She had found the place where the compact contradicted itself. The founding principle said the compact served civilization. The classification system as currently applied was demonstrably failing the civilizations it was supposed to serve. The review mechanism existed because the fund's founders had understood that law that cannot be examined is law that cannot grow, and law that cannot grow eventually fails the thing it was built to protect. She made that argument in 11 minutes, citing the compact's own language, and at the end of it she called the review in 3 words that the room received an absolute silence, and I stood there with my hands open and thought about a cold forest and a frightened child and a world with long hills and constant rain, and about how the distance between where we had started and where we were standing now had been traveled in the course of a single night by 2 people deciding to be honest with each other. It was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that looks small until you see what it sets in motion. The command deck of a Vortian flagship was designed around the principle that whoever stands at its center should feel the full weight of what they command. The forward wall was entirely given over to a direct visual feed of space, stars, and distance, and the permanent reminder of scale. The navigational and tactical display arrays swept in a wide arc, and the lighting was calibrated to make everything in the room feel deliberate and significant. General Oren had positioned himself at the center of the display arc with the precision of someone who had planned where he was going to be standing. When we arrived, 2 generals flanked him and 3 senior council advisors stood slightly behind, and 14 of the ship's security personnel who answered to council authority rather than to Seath personally were arranged in 2 lines at edges of the room. He had not come here to have a conversation. He had come here to make a record. He looked at me the moment we entered. His gaze moved to me first, which told me I was the instrument he was planning to use, and then it moved to Seath with the expression of someone who has been patient for a long time and has just reached the end of patience. And GT, Crown Heir. And GT, he said. His voice was not loud and did not need to be. The room was quiet enough that normal speech carried everywhere. You dismissed the council before the demonstration was formally concluded. You declined to return the classified asset to maximum security containment following the incomplete session. You remained in private communication with a grade 3 individual throughout the ship's full night cycle without any security protocols in place, without any record being kept, without any of the required oversight that our charter mandates for direct contact with foreign military personnel aboard a command vessel. He paused, setting each sentence in place with the care of someone building something they intend to be permanent. Under the terms of the succession Charter Section 14, any 3 members of the War Council may submit a formal observation that an heir's conduct is inconsistent with Voron leadership principles. That observation, if supported by 5 signatories, initiates a preliminary conduct hearing. I have the endorsement of 5 council members. I am presenting that endorsement. Formally and on the record, he produced the document. An attendant moved forward and placed it on the display surface. Between them, Seth stood very still. I stood beside her and looked at Orrin, and looked at the room and did what I always do when I enter a situation I need to understand quickly. I counted, and I measured and I assessed 14 security personnel, 6 in full tactical configuration spread along the right wall at intervals that created a response gap of approximately 4 seconds between any given position and the center of the room, 8 in standard gear grouped tighter on the left, which would make them slower to act individually because groups default to consensus. Orrin and his 2 generals at the center, 3 advisors behind them. 1 exit the door we had come through, now with 2 of the tactical personnel standing between us and it. Orrin had planned the geometry of this as carefully as a military operation, which it was. Furthermore, he continued, I am invoking Article 9 of the Charter, which permits the immediate temporary transfer of command authority to the senior council member present when an heir's conduct is under formal review. That article does not require a complete hearing. It activates upon the submission of a formal observation with 5 endorsements. He looked at Seth directly, which I have just submitted. He gestured to the security personnel on his left. They moved toward me. I felt the moment compress 6 seconds, possibly 7 before they reached me. I had mapped the room in the first 30 seconds of being in it. Orrin was standing at the worst possible position for someone trying to maintain control of a situation that went sideways, too deep in the room, too far from any exit, surrounded by people whose first instinct in a crisis would be to protect him rather than act independently. The 6 tactical personnel were well trained, but spread too wide for coordinated action. The 8 standard personnel on the left were close enough to each other to be a formation problem rather than a threat problem. I moved when the tactical personnel were 3 steps away, left and forward, a direction they had not waited for, through the gap between the first 2 before they had completed the adjustment of closing the gap. The first officer reached for me and I redirected the reach using the forward energy of it guiding him down and to the side in one continuous motion, face down. Unheard, controlled, removed from the equation. The second was faster and came from my right with good instinct, and I went low under the reach and used her own forward movement to place her beside the first one. The remaining 4 tactical personnel stopped, not because they lacked capability, because in the time it had taken to process the first 2, the geometry of the room had changed in a way their training had not prepared them for, and trained people who encounter an unprepared for geometry default to a half-second of recalculation. That half-second was all I needed. I was standing in the center of the command deck with 8 steps of clear space between me and anyone with an active weapon, my hands open at my sides, breathing normally. I looked at Orrin. His confidence was still present, but it had shifted its foundation. He was recalculating. Confident people recalculate when the variables change, and the variables had just changed in a way his model had not predicted. I am going to stand here, I said to him, and not touch anyone, because I am a guest on this ship. Guests do not initiate things, they respond. I turned to face Seth. I did not lower my voice for this part. I wanted everyone in the room to hear it. This is your moment, not mine. I can stand here all day if you need me to. But what happens next is yours to make. She looked at me. I had said what I had to say. Everything after this was hers. She looked at me for one long second, with her inner eyes focused in her outer one still and steady. Then she turned to face the room. She did not look at Oren specifically. She looked at the room the way a person looks at a space they intend to fill, and she began to speak. She spoke in Voron, and I followed the parts I could follow and read the parts I could not in Oren's face and in the faces of the generals beside him and in the posture of the advisors behind him. She was citing the compact. I caught provision numbers, chapter references, the specific terminology of founding law. She was not arguing against it. She was arguing through it, into it, using its own language to expose the thing it had always contained but never examined. She spoke for 11 minutes without stopping. I counted every one of them. She was making the case for the review, but she was making it from inside the compact's own framework, not from outside it, which meant Oren could not dismiss it as a rejection of hegemony values. He had to engage with it on its own terms, and engaging with it on its own terms meant acknowledging that the terms contained the possibility she was describing, and that acknowledgement was itself a concession he could not take back. I watched his face move through it. First, the controlled patience of someone listening for the weakness. Then, a tightening in his outer eyes as she reached of provision he had not anticipated her using. Then a longer stillness as the argument built on itself into something that had structural integrity, the kind you cannot simply dismiss because the pieces support each other. When she finished, the room was quiet in a different way from the quiet after I had set the sidearm down in the council chamber. That quiet had been shock. This quiet was something being absorbed. She turned to Oren. She said 3 words I only needed to know, 40 words of abortion too. Recognize those 3. I am calling a review. Oren was still. His 2 generals exchanged a look that was too quick and too controlled to be natural, the look of people who have just run a rapid calculation and do not like the result. His advisors did not move. You do not have the council support for a review. He said. His voice was level. The levelness was being maintained with visible effort. The support of the council is not required to call a review. She said. What is required is 7 signature witnesses to the formal declaration made by the ruling heir or heir apparent. I have them. She looked at the 2 security officers who were still on the floor, who had been watching the entire exchange from the most attentive possible position. I would appreciate it if you could stand, she said to them. I am formally requesting your witness to this declaration and your account of everything that occurred in this room tonight will be part of the official record. The 2 officers looked at each other, the rapid look of people deciding something important in a very short time. Then they stood. One of them looked at me briefly as she rose, the direct and evaluating look of a professional, and then she turned to Seth and straightened formally. Oren looked at me one last time. I met the look and held it without saying anything, because there was nothing to say. Then he turned and walked toward the door, and his generals followed, and his advisors followed behind them and the door closed. The command deck was very quiet. Seath stood at the center of it with 7 witnesses and a declaration that had just moved the largest empire in 11 star systems onto a path it had never traveled in 300 years of its existence. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she looked at me, and what was in her expression was not triumph. Triumph is light. What she was carrying was heavier and more durable than triumph. It was the specific weight of someone who has made the difficult decision rather than the easy one and knows that the difference and is choosing to bear that weight forward. You should go, she said. I will arrange transport back to Kesha 7. I know, I said. The review will take time, months before formal convening, years before the process reaches conclusions. I cannot tell you what those conclusions will be. I know, I said. You had no obligation to any of this, she said. Not to this ship, not to this empire, not to this night. You were here involuntarily. I was here involuntarily until you left the door unlocked. I said. After that it was a choice. She looked at me for a moment, and something in her expression moved very slightly, the small movement of a person setting something down they have been carrying for a long time. There is a word in standard, she said. I encountered it 2 years ago after the report on the Delm 4 incident was brought to my attention. I did not have sufficient context to understand it. Then she paused. Integrity, to act in accordance with what you believe is right consistently, even when no one is watching, and the cost is real. That is a good word. I said. It is a very good word, she said. We do not have it in Voron. We have words for discipline and loyalty and strength and strategic restraint. We have many words for things that benefit the empire. We do not have a word for the thing that makes a person sit in a cold forest for 6 hours with a frightened child who cannot give them anything in return. She paused. We will need to borrow it. She walked me to the hangar herself, the two of us and no one else, through corridors that were quiet in the way of a ship that has just had a significant thing happen and has not yet decided what to do with it. The pale gold of the dawn cycle was brightening through the ship's overhead panels toward the clean white of the operational day. At the hangar door she stopped. The review will require outside voices from the beginning, she said. Voices from every species currently under hegemony authority, and from those the hegemony has not yet formally encountered. Voices that can speak to both the documented record and the human reality of what that record describes. She looked at me directly. I will be making a formal request through Earth's diplomatic channels for a human representative to participate from the inception of the process, someone who has direct experience of both sides of this. I'm a sergeant, I said, not a diplomat. You dislocated your own thumb rather than harm anyone in that council chamber, she said. You sat in a dark forest for 6 hours with an injured child who was technically your military adversary, with no obligation and no witness and no possible benefit to yourself. You walked into a command deck confrontation involving 14 armed personnel and a formal legal proceeding. Put 2 officers on the floor gently and without injury, and then stood still and gave the moment to someone else because you understood it was not yours to take. She paused. I have met many diplomats. I have met none who understood those distinctions as clearly. You are exactly the kind of diplomat we need. I looked at the transport at the far end of the Hangar. Then I looked at her. I will have to talk to my commanding officer, I said. I would expect nothing less, she said. I walked to the transport and at the boarding ramp I stopped and looked back. She was standing at the hangar door and brightening, not performing anything, not managing anything, just standing there in the way of a person who has decided something important and is at peace with the difficulty of it. I boarded the transport, lifted through the forward window. I watched the flagship grow smaller against the stars, enormous and dark and full of a history that was beginning in ways that were small now, but would not stay small to change. I radioed my commanding officer, Captain Owen Garrett, from the transport seat. He answered on the second signal, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who has been awake waiting for a communication they were not sure was coming. Callum, he said. Current status: detained overnight. I said. Released at dawn under my own recognition. The situation is stable and moving in a direction I need to brief you on through a secure diplomatic channel rather than standard comms. A pause defined moving. I thought about the compact in its 9 sections and the false premise at its foundation. I thought about a review that had not been called in 300 years. I thought about an 11-year-old boy in a hospital on a Voron world who had asked his mother whether the humans sending the new treaty proposal were brave. I thought about a princess standing at a hangar door in pale gold light, carrying the weight of a decision that was going to be very difficult and had made it. Anyway, I thought about my grandfather's hands on my shoulders on a winter morning at the edge of a moor that went on further than I could see, telling me the world was bigger than any problem I was ever going to have. The empire that has been the primary obstacle to every diplomatic initiative Earth has put forward for the past decade just initiated a formal constitutional review of its own foundational law. I said it will take years, it will be complicated. There are people inside that empire who are going to spend every one of those years trying to prevent it from going anywhere meaningful. I paused, but it started. Tonight it actually started, and someone on our side needs to be in the room when it happens. Captain Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Callum, he said. Sir, are you telling me you spent one night as a prisoner on a Voron flagship and came back with a development that our diplomatic corps has not managed in 10 years of formal negotiations? I am telling you to send a diplomat, sir, I said. A real one with the proper credentials and the proper mandate, but also send me because I think I am going to be asked for by name, and it would be better if I went as something other than a sergeant. Another pause. I will make some calls, he said. Thank you, sir, I said. I leaned back and let the transport carry me home through the dark. Outside, the stars held their positions the way they always do, indifferent and permanent, and very far away. The flagship was no longer visible. Somewhere back in that ship, Sethvel was beginning the longest and most difficult work of her life. Somewhere in 11 star systems on 43 occupied worlds on Earth and on Kesha 7, and on a Voron world wherein 11-year-old boy had asked his mother question about bravery. The morning was arriving at whatever angle mornings arrive at on a given world, and everything that had happened in the night was still true. She had taken a human warrior to prove a point. She had prepared the demonstration with care and with certainty, and had arranged all the pieces in the right order. She had planned for 31 contingencies. Somewhere, between the cold shackles and the pale gold of dawn, in a long conversation, a small room while the stars moved. Outside in their steady arc, the demonstration had proven something else. Entirely, not that humanity was lesser. Not that our proposals were insufficient, not that the hegemony was right to keep its distance. It had proven that the distance itself was built on something that did not hold up when you looked at it honestly, and that looking at it honestly was possible, and that it was possible because a human soldier had sat in a dark forest one night with a frightened child and talked about the Moors until the child was not afraid anymore. And a princess had read that report 2 years later and carried a question she could not answer until the night she found the person who could show her that some answers are not in documents or probability models or 300 years of unbroken military record. She had seized a human warrior to prove a point. By dawn she had proven one. It was just not the one she had planned on. And in the space between the one she planned and the one she found, an empire had begun, slowly and with difficulty, and without any guarantee of where it would end up to.